don't know about you, but some days I'm scared to even get out of bed. The world is going to hell in a basket. Prices are surging, inflation is out of control, the climate is collapsing on our heads with every passing day. And I just want to go back to bed and sleep. And then, in one of those mornings when I'm trying to work up the nerve and energy to get out of bed, it hits me. Fear is what motivates and propels the characters in Bridgerton. And if it can get them moving and thinking, it can do the same for me. I apologize for how unserious today's video seems to be, but I do have a point, I hope. Also, blame the cold. I'm about 95% recovered and somewhere in the haze of the medications, trying to stay hydrated and resting. I got the idea for today's video, which ideally should have dropped yesterday, but refer to the just recovering from a cold and having to catch up on work, which is quite the combo, if I do say so myself. Now, I'm sure after I brought up the fact that fear is the number one motivator and the core emotion that propels all the story we've gotten so far in Bridgerton, you've most likely cast your mind back to try and either confirm or refute my claim. And because you all are pretty damn smart, you've probably started making the connections even as I'm speaking. Daphne is driven by the fear of what could possibly happen to her and her chances, with Anthony being a complete asshole who keeps ruining her chances at getting a match and has set things in place to force her into marrying the odious Nigel Burbrook. We know that it is Daphne's fears of her not possibly getting a match and being seen as undesirable that had her agree to Simon's suggestion that they fake an entanglement that would have everyone in the ton see Daphne as being desirable to a duke, which would in turn for fear of them, and by them I mean the single and available gentlemen of the ton. It is their fear of possibly losing out on quite the catch, that is Daphne Bridgerton, that has them coming out of the woodworks with the hope that they would be able to secure a match with her. Her fears, plus their fears, ensure that her calling card was full all season long. And when Nigel, upset at the possibility of him losing the chance to be with Daphne, proceeds to attempt to blackmail the Bridgertons, hanging the threat of Daphne being ruined by his lie over their heads. It is the fear of her daughter's possible future with a loathsome toad like Nigel that motivates Violet, who, after a visit with Queen Charlotte, where the latter's statement sparks a solution for her, schemes her way into acquiring the information needed to bury Nigel, reveal him for the cad he is, and thus run him out of their society, which in turn frees Daphne to continue her pursuit of a match that she wants. But what about Simon then, you ask? Simon, you say, was motivated more by spite and rage at the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father whilst he was a child. There's no fear in that. And to that I will say yes. Simon's fear doesn't show up in the promise he made to his father. His fear is more evident at the thought that he could possibly break that promise. Is terrified of what loving Daphne would do to him, would mean to him, and his plans to ensure that he has no heirs. It is this fear that initially has him stepping away from her after he realizes that they are getting too close. And it is his fear that has him terrified at the thought of losing her, follow her into the queen's garden, which results in him kissing her. Anthony discovers them, and the rest is history. Or rather, would almost have not been history because Simon is shown as not being afraid to die. He was quite willing to duel his former best friend and had made peace with being shot. No, he weighed his fears and his fear of tying Daphne to him in a marriage she would not want, one where she would not be able to have children because of his desire to ensure that his father's line dies with him, outweighed his fear of dying. It took Daphne showing up at the duel, willing to marry him anyway, to get him to change his mind. And it took Daphne talking to Simon at their season ending ball to have him see that he isn't as flawed as he believes and that he is still deserving and worthy of love. Now, the books do expatiate a bit more on Simon's fears, and I think that that is yet another way that the show does somewhat fail the books as an adaptation, as a lot of the context of the story we should have been given is missing. Simon's aversion to having children wasn't just because he was angry and feeling spiteful and wanted to send a message to his father's memory and image, even though, yes, that is a part of it. But in addition to that, he expresses a very valid fear that some children who grew up in abusive households have, that he would perpetuate the abuse and continue the cycle should he have kids. Part of his character resolution is being shown that yes, he is worthy of love, but also that he has nothing to fear. That in fact his fear that he might treat his future children horribly is more than enough proof that he is going to be a good father. One who is always conscious of what he has experienced and is unwilling to make his own children go through the same. Simon Basset grows through his fears and learns to live with it. It is that fear that bolsters him into being a decent father to the children that he and Daphne have in the books. And yes, I said children because they do have more kids than Augie. The Bridgertons are quite the fertile bunch, which would surprise no one really considering Violet had 8 kids. But outside of the romances in the first season, we have other characters whose stories were also propelled by their fear. It was Archibald's fear of losing everything and failing his family irrevocably that drove him to reach out to Will Mondridge so Will would throw his next match and they could rake in winnings from those who had bet on Will winning. It is the same fear of not being able to care for his family and having to try and fail at making a name for himself through his boxing that had Will take Archibald up on the offer. That fear is what took Will from being just a simple boxer to being a bar owner, which is quite the upscale. And he would have stayed there too if Alice's aunt hadn't died, which pulled his son and by extension the whole Mondridge family into British nobility. Marina, on the other hand, was rightfully terrified about her prospects. The man she loves seems to have abandoned her, and I know a lot of people point out that, well, technically she wasn't really abandoned. Portia and Varley were the ones who forged the letter, but at the same time, she is right in that George hadn't responded to any of her letters anyway, and time was running pretty fast. She had to make a hard call, and yes, her decision would have cuckolded Colin, but she was afraid for herself and her child, and did what she needed to do. The same can be said about Portia. It's the fear for her daughter's reputation being ruined because of Marina's indiscretion that had Portia pushing for Marina to marry any old lord who would have her, so her pregnancy can be covered with some measure of propriety. It is this same fear after Marina's lost her chances because of her disinterest in marrying men older than her father that led to Portia taking the very risky gamble of aligning with Marina's interest in getting Colin Bridgerton to fall for her. Like, yes, I know that it's also tied to the fact that Portia loved the idea of being connected to the Bridgertons by marriage, but it is also pretty obvious that at this point they were running out of time and out of prospects, and so it was easier for her to accept Marina's speech of Colin as a better suitor. Even Anthony's pretty horrible behavior to Daphne in the first season was driven by fear. I know a lot of people read him in the first season as being an inconsiderate asshat, and a lot of you all would be right. But at the same time, I don't think we can watch that season and not call out the fact that Anthony Bridgerton was terrified of fucking things up for his baby sister. She was the first to come out of all the girls, and to him fell the responsibility of not only being her big brother, but also being the head of house. As a young lady of respectable breeding, with an ample dowry from a well and long established house like the Bridgertons, I mean, Homegirl is the daughter and sister of a viscount. It is pretty obvious that there would exist unsavory people like Nigel Burberg or Lord Ambrose who only sought out Daphne because of a very, very substantial dowry. The onus thus falls on Anthony to weed them out. Now, I do admit that Anthony was an absolute asshat whose neck I certainly wanted to squeeze hard because of the way he treated Daphne throughout the entire debacle. And now he refused to simply listen to her for the longest time. But I'm also aware that what was driving Anthony's irrational behavior was not simply him wanting to exercise his authority over his baby sister. It was also his fear that he would not only royally screw things over for her, but that the stain would then be carried by the rest of the family. It is irrational and it was being utterly stupid, but whoever said fear was in any way rational? I mean, how else do we explain his absolute belief that if he marries a woman he loves and who loves him back, then he has doomed her to a life of pain and suffering when he dies early? Again, the show doesn't delve deeper into Anthony's fear from the books that he is going to die young like his father did, which makes even more sense to his brain because as at when we get his romance, he is inching closer and closer to the dreaded age. But like I said, fears aren't rational things, especially Anthony's. Which is why we get the entirety of season 2 with him trying to make it work with Edwina, even though he and the audience knew that it was always going to be Kate. He was terrified of what allowing himself to love and be loved by Kate would do to him. Every minute he acted up and made things even more complicated for himself and Edwina and Kate as well was whenever Kate pushed his buttons in a way that made him terrified of what he is capable of, i.e., ignoring his fears and choosing her anyway. And it is despite his fears of her being forever out of reach should she return to India that has him finally confessing his love for her, which brings them to their happy ending. Kate as well is driven largely by fear. It is her fear that her family has run out of money and there's no way she can take care of her baby sister anymore or secure her future in any way that leads to her accepting the Sheffields on their offer to provide for Edwina's dowry, but only if she marries an English gentleman. It is her fear that she's finding herself drawn to Anthony Bridgerton that exhibits itself with her constant clashes with him and then disagreeing on everything, but still having to navigate the attraction they have to each other, which they both know they absolutely cannot allow to stand. It is her fear that she would always be weak to this attraction that makes her so desperate to return to India with the hope that out of sight would be out of mind. And it is this same fear that has her running for the hills after she spends the night with Anthony Bridgerton and realizes that she's way down for that man. Of course, we know the accident that happens when she goes for this distracted horseback ride. And it is after she's all recovered and once again insistent on returning to India that Anthony finally gets the motivation he needs to confess to her and they get their happy ending. Meanwhile, Portia's fear that her family would be left out in the cold should Jack Featherington marry and bring in another woman as the new Lady Featherington is what leads to her scheming for a way to get Jack to notice Prudence as a potential match. When that doesn't work and it seems like he's all set on Cressida Cowper and her fears will soon be realized, she sets the stage and creates a scenario that would have Prudence and Jack Featherington alone in the orangery under false pretenses, which then forces Jack into proposing to Prudence in order to redeem her honor. And when Jack confides his fears that Portia has indirectly ruined everything for them as he is completely broke and had been hoping to come into some money by virtue of his marriage to Cressida, which was what Lord Ambrose was planning as well for Daphne back in season 1 until he was blocked and checked by Anthony. It is this fear of them being right back at square one that then leads Portia to come up with the brilliant idea of selling the fake rubies as a way to raise investment funds for Jack. And when their ruse was discovered by Colin Featherington, it was Portia's fear for her girls, brought on by the realization that Jack Featherington cared nothing for them, that had her turning away from the plans of a happy life away on the run in America that Jack had planned for both of them. Because we know that Penelope would survive. She's smart, she's resourceful, and she is Lady Whistledown. But we know that as the audience, Portia had no idea. And working with what she does know, she was rightfully terrified of leaving those girls alone. Because I don't know about you, but Prudence does strike me as someone who needs all the help. We also delve into Benedict's fear about his art, about being a true artist and being able to make art that means something, one that is recognized and accepted by his peers, from whom he hopes to gain some validation that it is not just a silly hobby, but art that matters. It is the reason why he's so upset about Anthony buying his way into the Royal Academy of Arts. Because even though Anthony thought he was trying to help, what instead happened is that he compounded Benedict's fears about his talent, his ability, and if he actually has what it takes to be an artist. And we see where those heightened fears take Benedict as a character. He leaves the Royal Academy of Art, goes back to a life of debauchery, and even when Paul asks him if he's an artist, he denies it. With Benedict, we can see how deeply rooted fears can bring a person to a state of not knowing exactly what they want or who they are. Of course, the expectation is that he would find purpose come season 4 when the focus is on his season, but I did want to point out that even though I believe that Benedict Bridgerton is very underutilized in the show, they at least are consistent with him also being maneuvered into the situations he finds himself as a result of his fears, just like everyone else in the cast. I mean, we all know that Eloise Bridgerton is very afraid. She's outspoken, she's pretty direct with what she wants, but she's also a young girl who is terrified at the thought of marriage, at the thought of motherhood and what it would do to her. We see in her conversations with Penelope and with Daphne, and to some extent Violet herself, that Eloise is terrified of losing herself, of losing sight of her own wants and desires because of her society's insistence on her being married. And that is a very valid fear. It makes her real in a way that some of the other ladies of the town aren't. And it is this fear that drives her a lot. It is why she keeps weaving her way in and out of any entanglement that Violet might want to prod her into, even as she shows a clear disdain for them. It is a fear she's always assumed she shared with Penelope, which is why she was so confused when the latter expressed her own desire for an eventual suitor and marriage. And let's not forget that it spends very valid and very real fear of what would possibly happen to her best friend should the queen continue with her insistence that Eloise is Lady Whistledown, which led to her ousting Eloise as a radical in the Lady Whistledown issue. Yes, we can all debate about the other factors that were definitely in play, which led to Penn making that decision, but I'm sure no matter where you stand on the divide about Penelope Featherington, we can all agree that in that moment she was afraid for her friend. Like, I believe that her ousting Marina's pregnancy in Lady Whistledown to foil the planned elopement between Marina and Colin was also out of fear of Colin being tied to a woman who clearly doesn't love him and is just using him as a front to protect herself and her baby in a situation that would most likely come to light pretty quickly and turn him into a laughing stock amongst his peers. But there are people who would argue that Penn's motive was more self serving in that situation. And to that, I can agree that there are valid points for both sides of the divide. But with regards to Eloise being shown up as a radical, I think we can all agree that that was driven by fear. Fear at her identity being revealed and needing to keep better track of how she conducted her business is what led to Penelope going into business with Genevieve Delacroix, where the latter was in charge of getting the written columns to the publishers and Penelope was in charge of getting the writing done. It is what helped her keep her secret safe without anyone else knowing. And it is when she decided to step out of that in order to help a panicking Eloise, who was terrified of what damage Cressida's attempt at being Lady Whistledown would do to her family in the column Cressida was writing, that her secret was revealed. Penelope being driven by Eloise's fears and the fear that they were running out of time didn't have the time or space to deliver the column like she's always done in the past, i.e., via Genevieve. She instead goes in to hand it over herself and was discovered by Colin, who was able to see for himself that she really is Lady Whistledown. Colin's fears, meanwhile, is what comes right to the front with his reaction to the discovery of Penelope as Lady Whistledown. Just as he admits to her later, we see that, sure, he is envious of her being able to successfully pull off a writing career and get all the praise and accolades that he desires for himself as a writer. But he also does admit that he fears for her. With the queen on her tail and everybody that she's written about, Penelope's position and role in their society as Lady Whistledown puts a mark on her back that has Colin terrified of everything that could go wrong and how she could be hurt as a result of her written words. Which, when you consider it, is a pretty valid fear. It's just that in the season, it was all mixed up with his envy and jealousy and anger, and so sometimes the fear was lost in the mess, but it was there. And Colin's fears were realized with Cressida discovering Penelope's secret and choosing to blackmail her as a result of that. Of course, we can't talk about Cressida and not mention the reason why she resorts to blackmail. She is also scared. She's scared of the fact that her choices are pretty limited. Her father is either going to force her to marry a decrepit old man, old enough to be her grandfather, or she'll be forced into some sort of exile, banished away to live with an aunt who hates everything colorful about her. It is this lack of choice and fear of what her future could possibly look like that pushes her to first attempt to claim the Lady Whistledown identity as her own and later resort to blackmailing Penelope. Also, she can get the money that she needs to live her own life, to live her life on her own terms, never to be terrified again of her father making choices that would affect her adversely without her getting a say in what happens. And that is a pretty valid fear that moves the plot forward. And like I said, this applies to a lot of the characters. Violet's actions towards Francesca and John's relationship is driven by her fear that what they have isn't really true love. Queen Charlotte haranguing her children to birth an heir is out of her fears that them not doing so would destabilize the dynasty of her beloved George. Even King George's choice to be tortured into some version of sanity by a psychotic, inept doctor is born out of his fear and desire to achieve a semblance of normalcy and not be looked at as odd by either his people or his new bride. Fear propels a lot of the plot of Bridgerton, and I've been fascinated a lot by how it's been such a core and central part of the story. Or do you disagree with me on that? Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. I am starting my first ever watch of Arcane. I know. I can't believe it's taking me this long to watch it, but I want to be caught up before season 2 arrives come November 8th. So let me know if you'll be down to watching arcane content on my channel should I start making it. But yeah, hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, hit the dislike button if you didn't. I have nothing to fear and all I feel is gratitude that you watched my content long enough to interact with it. Thank you. Share this video if you think others should hear what I have to say. I think I'm one of the few creators still talking about Bridgerton, and yeah, it would be great if others saw my video too. It all helps my channel grow and is incredibly supportive of my content. Speaking of support, a huge thank you to my patrons who are more than instrumental in helping me keep the lights on. Thank you all. If you would love to support me on Patreon as well and can afford to do so, the link to it is in the description box. I make new videos 3 times a week: Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Whilst you wait for new content from me, do check out my Bridgerton and Does the Punishment Fit the Crime video, where I talk about Cressida and Archibald Featherington and their fates in the story and if it is truly deserved. It's one of my worst performing Bridgerton videos, and I feel a bit sad about that. But yes, until next time, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.